Good afternoon, everybody. I see that it is 1 p.m. Um, my name's Helen, and I do public programs and outreach here at the Western Cape Archives and Record Service. And I'd like to welcome you all to our final Archives Week talk, which is under the theme Archives for Justice. And throughout the week, we've looked at preserving the past as a form of justice in terms of dignity and remembering the past. Empowering the present in terms of using records for redress and social justice issues, and also innovating for the future and how archives and technology and AI could possibly help with Archives for Justice going forward. So I am going to introduce our speaker now, and then please feel free to put any questions you have in the chat at any time. We will also have time after she speaks to where you could raise your hand and ask some questions. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Humo Magano. She is a researcher, curator, and storyteller. She was a curatorial facilitator at the Michaelis School of Fine Art here in Cape Town. But she is now we've lost her to Johannesburg. She is now the art curator for ABSA in Joburg. And her work and her research explores memory, identity, and archival practice in Southern Africa, and reimagining the archive itself, not merely as a repository of documents, but as a living, ethical, and relational space where imagination, consent, and care shape meaning. So I'm sure Humo's going to unpack that for us very nicely. So at this point, I'm going to hand over to her, and I will share her slides.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I hope I'm audible. Can I just get a thumbs up if everyone can hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, and everybody, you can share. You can see my screen that I'm sharing for you.
Yes, for sure. I
Okay,
can see.
cool.
Thank you.
All good.
I'll just let you know when I want a different slide. Thank you very much, Helen. So good afternoon, everyone. I would like to sort of begin by thanking Helen and the Western Cape Archive for the invitation to speak as part of Archives Week. It is a real privilege to be a part of the conversation under the theme Archive for Justice. A theme that I think for me asks not only to think about preservation, but about memory, responsibility, power maybe, and the politics of what counts as the ideas of history. Before I continue saying anything about myself, which was already nicely unpacked by Helen, I want to begin with a little bit of a story that I spent some time on social media than I probably would like to admit. And some time ago, while scrolling on social media one evening, I came across a page called The South Remembers. I'm not sure on which social media platform did I come across from. I can't remember. In this page, the owner of the page takes us back to pop culture moments many of us have sort of forgotten or maybe haven't had time to get remembrance of, or perhaps never realized that they were worth remembering in the first place. So in the pages, old television clips, advertisements, magazine covers, school uniforms, hairstyles, music, you name it, family photographs, and the kinds of cultural pieces that often sits outside official histories. But I think what stayed with me is was not only about what they were showing, it was how they were telling the story. It does not feel or rather, it does not feel like history as you often encounter it in academic spaces, museums or state archives, which is often ordered, it is categorized, it's footnoted, it's stabilized. But in this page, instead, it is alive, it's intimate, it's sometimes humorous, and sometimes deeply emotional. So memory in the page sort of unfolds through pieces, through stories, and people commenting, "Oh, I remember that, and that was my neighborhood," or "My mother used to have that," and stuff like, "I thought I was the only one that remembered this." And as I and as I kept returning to the page, I found myself thinking, this sort of felt strangely familiar. Not because I had seen those exact images before, but because the logic of the remembering felt deeply connected to my own research. My name is Kuma Magano. I am a researcher. I'm a curator. I'm a storyteller working between Johannesburg, and I'm still a little bit attached to Cape Town, so I'm just going to mention Cape Town in that. My practice moves across curatorial work, archival thinking, storytelling within Southern Africa, with focus on memory, identity, inheritance, and ways in which histories are produced, stored, circulated, and quite often excluded. It is from this concern that my research project, Kankulu, the thing that matters, emerges. In this work, I explore how memory is produced, not through institutional archives, which is museums, which is libraries and universities, so and so, but also through what I call living archives, through land, through letters, through oral histories, through dreams, through domestic objects, through gossip, maybe through the rumor too, through photographs, and through the everyday practices of remembering that families carry across generations. And I think what the South remembers reminded me precisely is that archives are not always institutional, that archives are not always cataloged, that archives are not always written, and perhaps most importantly, archives are not always what are always possibly aware that they are archives. So what the page on social media sort of made visible to me were many of the same archival etiquettes, or perhaps archival conditions that I have been trying to think through on my own research. Intimacy, affect, fragment, recognition, maybe repetition, the ideas of storytelling, community participation, the unfinishedness, and collective authorship. So, in other words, memory there does not arrive as a complete record. It arrives as a fragment that asks others to participate. And that for me is profoundly archival because scholars sort of speak about decolonization, decolonizing the archive. And that for me demands that we rethink not only what enters the archive, but what the archive itself is. And also, that is also where my research question in Kankolo begins. And at the center of this work is my grandmother, Lena Mutletra, which we usually called her Maspech Mokoti, who taught me long before academia did, that some of the most important archives are sort of the ones that never imagined themselves as archives at all. And unfortunately or fortunately, I am the South that remembers. She was born in Botswana and became a teacher and married a South African man, which is my grandfather. Next slide, please, Helen. Next slide, Helen. Thank you. So to understand my grandmother's, I'm not gonna go through everything else that she went through, because I think we would spend the whole day here if I had to do that. So I'm just gonna take bits and pieces to make up a story so that you sort of get a sense of where my research and curatorial work stems from. So to understand my grandmother's political consciousness, I think one has to begin with a longer history of dispossession that sort of shaped the lives of Baragologadi Bagamouti, which is now the northwest province of South Africa. Like many Black communities under colonial rule and later apartheid, the Baragologadi Bagamouti experienced sort of this systemic loss of land through state legislation, forced removals, the consolidation of white commercial farming, and the bureaucratic restructuring of African territorial life under what is known as Native Land Act and subsequent apartheid special policies. Land was not simply taken as territory. It was sort of in pieces and fragmented through administrative violence, through permits, through boundaries, through title deeds, through commissions and chiefs who increasingly found themselves negotiating within state-imposed systems of authority. So by the time I was growing up, these histories were not encountered in textbooks or museums. They were spoken about in kitchens and funerals and in villages, in meetings, and in the unfinished conversations of elders who had lived through consequences of dispossession. And my grandmother, I'd like to say fortunately, because I know it's very unfortunate that she went through what she went through. But fortunately, she was one of the elders that you were the center of talking about these land disposition and every other thing. She did not speak about land as an abstract political question, but as lived and unresolved matter. Excuse me. She she regularly attended what in Setswana we call lekgotla. I think most of you might be familiar with the word as is used in political scenes in South Africa, which is community assemblies where questions of land, leadership, inheritance, and belonging were debated, often with intensity, at least from my own remembrance. She would return from these meetings sometimes frustrated and deeply invested in what she saw as the ongoing failure of local leadership to inadequately account for the historical claims of the community. She spoke particularly about the disputes involving the traditional authority, questioning the decisions around land allocation and the management of communal territory. In these moments, I began to understand her not as simply as a grandmother, but as a political actor, someone who actively participating in the production and defense of community memory. Equally significant were her writing practice. Long before I began thinking about archives and as an academic concern, my grandmother had already developed her own archival system. Whenever she traveled between Botswana and South Africa or moved between family homes, she wrote letters documenting her movements, her intentions, and her whereabouts. What remains striking for me, or rather to this day, is that she she always wrote two versions of the same letter. One copy which would remain at home, which would be in a brown suitcase, which is still there now, but a lot worn out. And then the second copy would be placed in an envelope, and then it will be stamped and then sent across border to relatives in Botswana or anywhere else in the country. This for me was to ensure that those on the other side of the family network also knew where she was and where she had been and where she intended to go next. At the time these practices appeared ordinary, only later did I begin to understand what my grandmother was producing was not simply correspondence, but sort of this a parallel archival system, one grounded in kinship, maybe mobility, political uncertainty, and the necessity of self-documentation. So her letters, much like her participation in the Khotla, reveal a woman that is deeply aware that movement, land, and memory required constant record. So Kankolo, in which is a Setswana word that means the big issue. That's a direct translation of it. The thing that matters is sort of concerned with the simple but difficult question: what counts as something worth remembering? More importantly, who gets to decide what matters? And through my grandmother's letters, stories, and everyday practices of care, I sort of came to understand that memory is not only something preserved in institutions, it is something sometimes that is lived and transmitted and sustained in relation. And from this starting point, I began to think about archives not as static repositories of knowledge, but as systems that exist in land, in families, in oral histories, in dreams, and in everyday acts of remembering. So what interests me in this dialogue is how intimate materials, whether letters, photographs, stories, between private and public homes and the public life of the archive, and how the meanings of the archive shifts as they enter new systems of preservation and interpretation. Next slide, please, Helen. So in Kankulu as a concept, I have like different ways of thinking. I think with other thinkers. So to think with this, I engage with a set of thinkers who help me frame and challenge my own thinking, if I could call it that. So I begin with Jacques Derrida in Archive Fever, where he sort of reminds us that the archive is never neutral. It is always structured by power, maybe by authority, and the desire to control what can be remembered. The archive is not only about preservation; it's about governance of memory. I think, in my own thoughts. I also think with Walter Benjamin. And his writing on reproduction of aura, Benjamin helps us understand that when objects of memory, such as photographs or letters, are reproduced or digitized, something in them or something shifts rather. Their material presence, maybe their intimacy, their singular relation to time and place is sort of transformed. In thinking about the letter in Black Radical Thought, I tend to Tendai Sithole in his reading of the letter as a political and philosophical side within the Black Radical Thought, where writing becomes a form of intervention against dehumanization. Through the analysis of people like Aimé Césaire, Frantz Fanon, he sort of develops a typology of maybe epistemic, fugitive, and resignation letters, not because the letter is merely correspondence, but excuse me, but because it becomes a mode through which Black radical thinkers confront the conditions that sort of seek to deny their humanity. In this sense, the letter reveals how thought, even under constraint, becomes a site of refusal. So this attention to fragments has also shaped how I return to stories told by my grandmother. Some of these stories were complete in their telling, while others are partial. Some of them were interrupted or never fully recorded in any formal sense. they circulated through memory of myself as an 8-year-old, and everyday speech, but not all of them survived in stable form. In my writing, I have tried to work with these gaps, not by attempting to complete what is missing, but by thinking through them as meaningful absences that still carry presence. Along this, excuse me. Along this, Saidiya Hartman's concept of critical fibrillation allows me to approach archival silence not as absence, but to be felt, but as a space that maybe demands ethical imagination. So Saidiya insists that when working with histories shaped by violence and erasure, the task is not to reconstruct a full and seamless narrative, but to remain with the fragment, to speculate carefully, and to imagine without claiming total recovery. So critical fibrillation for me becomes a method of staying close to what cannot be fully known, while still refusing to abandon it to silence, if I should say that. Then in this way, the fragments of my grandmother's stories become part of the broader methodological concern, how to write with what is incomplete, how to think with what resists closure, and how to hold memory without forcing it to final form. In thinking with the concept of the matriarchive, I draw on Uhuru Palafala, polyglot internationalism, and the matriarchive, the case of Kyora Petsakhositsile, where she sort of develops the matriarchive as a way of recentering the maternal figures of epistemic structures of memory, language, and the political consciousness. In this framing, the grandmother is not positioned as as a peripheral or domestic object or figure, but as a central site through which knowledge is carried and translated across many different generations. So the matriarchive, therefore, names an archival formation that exists outside institutional documentation, which is grounded in relation, orality, and affect, and possibly in inherited forms of knowing that often excluded from official systems of record. So this understanding is crucial for now, as I approach my own grandmother, not as a subject of content within the archive, but as a living structure of memory, through which history is continuously interpreted. So in my work, this becomes particularly tangible through my engagement with my grandmother's identity photograph, which is somewhere in the slides. Rather treating the ID as a fixed authoritative marker of identity. I approach it as a contested archival object, while the state sort of frames the ID as a tool for classification and administrative control. I reread it in my research through memory, storytelling, and lived relations, incorporating the many stems that she accumulated while crossing the border in and out of South Africa. Thank you. Next slide, please, Helen. So that's a picture of my grandmother's ID that we framed and put it in her room divider at her house. So I think my grandmother never imagined herself as an archive. She was just an apartheid teacher. She was she was not a public intellectual, nor she was a formally published. She did not leave behind a sort of catalogued collection, a finding aid or formally accessions forms through which her life could be easily located within institutional memory. She was just a homemaker, a storyteller, and I would say she loved politics and a politically engaged village woman. And a writer of letters, if I should add that. Excuse me. She was also a woman who could gather children. Excuse me again. Gather children on what in Setswana we call pate. It's a goat skin. We use it to sit on the ground. Yeah, it has a long history. If I have to go through that, we'll possibly spend another 30 minutes wasting time on it. And through Setswana storytelling, she would create informal yet rigorous spaces of learning, memory, and social transmission. So my interest in history led me back to these ordinary practices of telling stories, going to the khotla as I began working through her letters. Her letters are still there in that very same suitcase that she left them in. Stories, routines, and silences, and her ongoing frustrations about questions of land and leadership. And I began to recognize that what I had initially understood as domestic or familial acts were, in fact, forms of archival practice. My grandmother has always been engaged in the work of preserving, transmitting, and organizing knowledge. Um, Although not through institutional systems or formal archival methods, rather, this work was carried through relationships, through repetition, through oral transmission, through correspondence and acts of care. This recognition became the central development of Kankolo. Um, I think the project is emerged maybe as an attempt to take seriously the everyday practices through which knowledge is produced and maintained and maybe passed through generations. Next slide, please. So in this thinking, I began to think with land because I think that's where I sort of began, where the story sort of began, because I started hearing stories. And I think that was like a point of my departure. Um, in the histories of Barakologadi, Bachamautwe, land was dispossessed from them, and now it's used as a commercial space, which harbors the Madikwe Game Reserve. Story for another day is a bit too long. Land is sort of is central to understanding how dispossession has been experienced and transmitted across generations. Land was not only a resource of boundary, but is the basis of settlement, social organization, and the historical continuity. So with continual and apartheid land systems, this relationship was sort of fundamentally altered through administrative restructuring, forced removals, legal reclassifications, of land ownership. This did not only involve the loss of physical space, but also the disruptions of burial sites, which are currently in a bad state, exposed and every other thing. The breaking of spatial continuity became between families and ancestors. And the weakening of local systems of knowledge tied to specific landscapes. So in the case of Barakologadi, these processes sort of produced layered histories of relocation and reconstitution, which right now they occupy a land that is like 10, 15 kilometers away from the actual land that was dispossessed. So these processes produced layered histories of relocation, where memory of place and continued and of place continued even when physical access to land was restricted. So my engagement with this begins through her, where she tells stories um, on and asks questions of who accounts of land that are not abstract but grounded in sort of lived experiences. So again in my research, I approach land not as a static historical object, but I sort of approach it as an active side of memory production. Next slide, please, Helen. So in second form of archive, I think with letters, like I already mentioned, in my family, letters written by my grandmother were not simply communication. She took that practice very seriously, and she had like a table in the corner of her house, her room, where she used to use it to write letters. That is one of the letters that is on the slide. You most probably cannot read what is written because it's written in Tswana and it's very, yeah, some of them I can't read them because her handwriting is just different. Um, so they were events that structured time and attention in the household. I remember the arrival of a postman in his bicycle. I think I was 10 or something, and how it created anticipation um, long before we opened the letter. When a letter arrived, it was not read privately, it became a collective activity. So my family would gather in the kitchen or the dining room, and we would read it aloud and with interruptions, responses, and clarification. So this is why I approach letters not as static documents, but as relational archives. So their meaning does not reside in their written content, but in their circulation, um, their reading, and the social context in which they are received and shared. Um, in thinking about this, I draw on Walter Benjamin, which helps frame what is at stake when such intimate and situated objects are reproduced, digitized, or reclassified within institutional systems. In these processes, the letter is separated from conditions of its original circulation. So what shifts is not only what I say is the material form, but the relational context that gave it meaning. Um, so the letter for me is not only a document of communication, it is a form of relational memory that continues to give. So now, as archives increasingly move to digital systems, and we are faced with new ethical questions, digitization promises access, preservation, and maybe democratization, but it also transforms the materiality of memory. Um, Beyond theory, the question I'm interested in is what happens to relational memory when it becomes data? When my grandmother's letters are digitized, or what forms of intimacies are preserved, and what forms are altered or maybe lost? And so we must ask, what does justice look like in archival practice? Digitization is often presented to as as the future of archival justice. You scan it, you upload it, you increase access, you democratize knowledge. But I want to complicate that assumption. In Southern African context, the question is not only about aura, it is about ethics. When I digitize my grandmother's letters, who owns the digital copy and who sort of decides who gets access, who controls circulations, who maybe profit from this visibility? Um, does maybe digitization automatically produce justice as we claim it's justice? Next slide, please. So that is one of my on the picture, one of my childhood homes in the Northwest. So the third archive that I think with is the oral history and maybe rumor. In Setswana traditions, knowledge is carried through dinani, or which I like to call the work of reimagining otherwise, or imagining otherwise, through storytelling and through the speech. It is also carried through mabarabare, maybe rumor, which operates as a form of circulating maybe social narration rather than fixed documentation. In this sense, it is a formulation of mabarbari as a mode of rumor that holds narrative, maybe speculation and communal interpretation as part of how knowledge is produced and sustained, rather than maybe treating rumor as unreliable or outside of history. I understand it as a form of social memory. It sort of carries these pieces of truths, interpretation, and collective meaning that move through communities maybe over time. Oral history, in this sense, it is not fixed in my um, research. It is transmitted, it's reshaped, and it may be reinterpreted across times and contexts and generations. So here, for me, the archive is not stable. It is spoken, it is shared, it is collective. Next slide, please. The fourth archive, or rather the last one, I think, is dreams. In my family, dreams are not treated randomly or purely psychological events. They are interpreted, discussed, and shared within household and extended families. The understanding of dreams is also grounded in embodied and partial practice. I recall how my grandmother would gather us and tell us about a dream that she had and that we need to take into account for. I was still a kid. I just thought that does not apply to me. Um, so here I view the archive not only what is visible or written, but it is also experienced, interpreted, and remembered through other forms of consciousness and embodied practice. So my research in this aspect asks a question that often unsettles unconventional archive discourse. Can dreams be archived? Within epistemological world I inherited, dreams are not random psychological events. They are communicative spaces. They are warnings, visitations, maybe messages and interruptions. And sometimes they are not only place where they are the only place where the dead can continue to speak, yet within dominant archival framework shaped by Western epistemologies, dreams, oral stories, spiritual encounters, and embodied knowledge are often dismissed as subjective, unverifiable, or insufficiently documentary. I argue in the sense that colonial knowledge systems have historically delegitimized indigenous knowledge ways of knowing by refusing to recognize their intellectual and methodological legitimacy. And so I ask, if a dream changes how a family understands itself, if a folklore preserves ethical knowledge across generation, even oral story maybe shapes communal memory for decades. Why are these not archives? So I want to return to where I began, which is Khankolo as a methodology or a research inquiry. Khankolo is not only about what is preserved, it is about what continues to matter. And what continues to insist on being remembered even when it's not formally recognized. Through land, letters, oral histories, and dreams, I've tried to show you that archives are not fixed systems of storage. Maybe by exposing myself quite a lot because I speak about something that is very close to me. They are sort of relational structures of memory that shaped by sort of care, inheritance, displacement. My grandmother, I don't want to take her as an example in this work. She's the methodology through which I understand what an archive can be and what it means to carry memory outside formal systems of documentation. At the same time, I want to acknowledge that this work is still information. It does not offer complete theory of the archive, nor does it resolve the questions it raises. Rather, it is part of an ongoing attempt to sort of understand how archive operate beyond their institutional definitions and how they might be rethought through lived experience, relation, and memory. In this sense, I see myself as working along the path, working along pathway toward understanding the archive rather than producing the final account of it. Um, Kankolo, therefore, as a research, it's not what is taught in institution. It is what continues to live across generation, across spaces, across forms of relation. And so I want to end not with closure, but with questions. What would it mean to take seriously forms of memory that are not stabilized in institutional archives? How might we rethink archival practice if we begin from relation rather than record? And what other ways of knowing become possible if we sort of could say accept that archive is already broader than systems that claim to contain it? So when we speak about Archive for Justice, I would again like to suggest that justice cannot begin with storage. Justice cannot begin with maybe classification. Justice cannot begin with digitization alone. Maybe justice begins with archives when maybe archives sort of move beyond preserving what institutions inherited and begin repairing what institutions are erased. And so I would like to leave you with the same question that I've sort of been iterating from the beginning until now. Not necessarily what an archive is, but who in your family, in your community, in your history deserves to become one before they disappear. Thank you very much for listening to me, Rand.
Thank you so much, Kumo. Wow, you've given us some amazing food for thought there. And actually, my question I jotted down was exactly the question you ended with. So thank you. I'd like to open the floor now to any comments or questions. You can put them in the chat, or anybody can put a hand up, and we will take those. Stand silence.
That means I wasn't that interesting.
No, I think well, while people are thinking about it, oh, there's one. Okay, Nomaza, question.
Okay, thank you, Kumo. Thank you. Good afternoon, colleagues. Thank you, Kumo, for that. Yeah, it was a very interesting presentation from your side. We really appreciate it. No, I just noted also some of the questions that we had, and I'm thinking it's very interesting questions around, and maybe some of the issues that we need to look at as archives, especially through digitization. Questions, for example, that we had about how is the issues or forms of intimacy kept while digitizing, and also some of the questions that around the ownership and the access and profit. Just to I do understand maybe do some archives works differently, and we are learning in the process. But in some instances, some of the archives have got the responsibility to also preserve the non-public records, which is then the private records, the private collection. So just as an example, if then, let's say, your letters or the archives of your grandmother, you would like to provide it to the broader public, and because it's very interesting, then in archives there can be an arrangement between you and the family and the archives in terms of the donation of the non-public records. With the donation of non-public records, then again, definitely the family is at the center as well of the process in terms of the agreements, in terms of what would you like to see, as in terms of the collection. And let's say now the archives on the other side, indicating, because part of the thing is to say, now that you have this, are you allowing the archives or whatever institution to change, let's say now to digitize, and the issue of access, whether you are allowing access. So some of those things are sort of like taken care of, if I can put it that way, in some policies that are. But as I say, it's definitely a negotiation. It's not one-sided kind of thing. So it's a negotiated process. And I think when it comes to digitalization, it's also, as I say, we're still learning. We still, all of us, and we maybe from the group as well, from the team, they can advise. I was thinking now when you're talking about how do we keep those intimacies. I think sometimes because what is digitized and what is on paper, there are people who, like, they that value more what is they sort of like they can touch. But I think one of the things some institutions do try is to say, if you digitize, for example, your letters, we'll digitize them as they are, without making them, the copy will look exactly the same as what you've provided. But then again, there are issues, for example, the handwriting, the handwriting and the language. Then the discussion would be about the transcriptions and the translations, again with the owners, to say, can we transcribe this so that it's more readable for those people that can read the very language, or then translation for those that can't understand the language, so that there's broader access. As I say, it's all kind of discussions and that are available, and some avenues that are available. Thank you.
Thank you, Nomaza. Do you want to respond, Kumo, or should we take the next question?
Thank you. I think she answered like most of the questions that I've been asking throughout. Thank you.
Okay. Tsidiso.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone, and Kumo. Mine is just a compliment to say a good presentation there, Kumo. I'm from Northwest, so I'm familiar with the area and the stories that your grandmother was sharing.
Okay.
And yeah, it's encouraging that we should also try and collect our grandmother's stories and keep them safe and try to archive them, because we all have a grandmother story
Yeah,
that
for
we
sure.
all cherish. So thank you very much. A great presentation.
Thank you, Tsidiso.
Thank you, Tsidiso. I think the question that I had, that maybe Nomaza touched on from an institutional perspective, but I'd like your comment on, is, do you feel like some of the things that you were talking about, the letters, even the letters which are tangible, but obviously the stories and stuff, do they need to remain outside the traditional institutional archiving structures in terms of the concept of archive, in order for them to live, to be part of that memory of community and stuff? Does putting them in a traditional format, like Nomaza is talking about, and taking that suitcase and putting it somewhere, obviously it's got pros, but it's also got cons. And I just wondered if your idea is that those institutions need to change their whole way and approach in terms of collecting, or whether those things should always remain outside those formal structures.
I personally think that, okay, right now we are going through the process of restitution, which I don't know what that looks like on paper, but for me, if we are going through a process of restitution, then maybe we shouldn't have started with taking the stuff that don't belong to institutions from where they were originally at, because excuse me, not every archival institution has to collect everything. I think we don't necessarily have to collect everything, unless if I feel like my grandmother's letters can have like a sense of knowledge that can be shared with the public, then it gets to be me that decide on that. But if, like right now, on my research is complete. I've submitted it, but I still haven't shared my grandmother's letters. So I still have like limitations on, do I actually want to share this with the public or not? And I just shared fragments of it and them folded and not showing the actual information inside of them. So I think for me, it's a very intimate thing for me to continue to want to share. And I think the biggest question in my mind, would she have wanted to share them? And obviously she probably wouldn't have, because they were in a suitcase in a corner somewhere. But I think we can archive the knowledge that comes from them and not necessarily the actual letters themselves. Unless if a person feels like it's okay, it can be an institutional archive.
Okay. Any other questions or comments? I guess my follow-up to that would be, what about the social aspect or the performance aspect, the communal aspect that you talked about, the reading of the letters and the kind of the performance being part of those things, and that's quite different from like letters in a kind of colonial government archive where I'm sitting now, where they were not meant to be performances. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. How do we capture that as an archive, or don't we? Maybe we don't.
I think, and I think I mentioned this last year with my engagement with you. I think for me, community engagement is the most important aspect of archival thinking, because in as much as we don't necessarily, we can make time. Time is always there. We can make time to engage with the communities, to learn about them, archive what we take away from them and what they decide to tell us, and not necessarily sort of take what is there, take what they give us. So for me, I think the idea of community engagement is the most important aspect of engaging with archives in different parts of the country or spaces that we could engage with. So if they offer us the archive as is, then perfect. If not, let's listen to what they're saying. It draws us back to the idea of storytelling. Let's listen to their stories, believe what they want to, what they are telling us, and then take it as is.
Great, thank you. Any other questions or comments? Okay, so I don't see any other comments or questions. Last chance, if you want to put anything, put your hand up for our guest. Okay, I'm good. Then I think we were going to leave it there. But thank you so much, Kumo, for that amazing presentation that I think really like touched on so many aspects of Archives for Justice. And I think Vern Harris yesterday in his talk left us with what should be our big task right now as archives and archival institutions. And I'm going to email him right now, because I think you've posed it. Like, how does the archive transform in this way, and accommodate, or maybe not accommodate some of what you've given us, and what are the ethics around it? So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us this week for all our talks. And there will be a recording of this. So if you would like that, I will put my email in the chat and you can email me. And thank you so much, Kumo, and everybody for coming today. Have a good weekend.
Thank you very much to everyone that joined us.